young, I'm not a kid anymore. But some days I sit and wish I was a kid again. Back in the days when I was young, I'm not a kid anymore. But some days I sit and wish I was a kid again.
What's happening, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of 717. My name is Dan, and I hope that you've been able to take what I've been putting out there and applying it to your own life as you look to go back in the day. Remembering way back when and going through your whole life all the way back to your own self as a kid in order to make sense of why your own individual world is the way that it is today and to make better sense of the world at large. Because the world at large is seemingly more and more confusing every single day. It gets more and more destructive. It gets more and more chaotic. But how many of us can say that about our own lives? Because that overall world, it's comprised of us. And so if that's what's happening at the macro level, we all have our own individual worlds to look at to see what negativity am I contributing to that overall world? What needs looking at in my own life? If you are unhappy, if you live in fear, if you are angry, if you are just unfulfilled and living a blah life, why not go back and look at, well, how did it become this way? You will be absolutely amazed at what you can find and what you can overcome. Because a lot of times going back is a painful thing. But every time you heal something from your past, every time you understand something or someone better, you get stronger. You get a little bit more calmer, you get balanced, you get more empathetic. And just because I'm making these videos does not mean that I'm perfect or I don't have work to do. I have plenty of work to do. We all do. We've all been programmed decade after decade after decade of things that are really not in the best interest of the human experience. And so it's up to us to change that. But before we can even have a conversation with one another, we have to have the conversation with ourselves. We have got to go back and look at why our own individual lives have turned out the way they have. And that's the idea behind 717. July 17th being my birthday, you go back to the day you were born and you go through it all. You understand everything and everyone and all the circumstances that you've gone through. But to take it up a notch, 717 is a palindrome, right? Where it's the same forward as the same backward. And the idea here is from the day you were born till right now, being the forward progress, you go back to the day you were born. And by understanding and smoothing everything out, you can have a complete cycle that is fulfilled, balanced, and you ultimately do end up appreciating everyone and everything that you've been through because you realize that all of that was in your life for a reason. And so I'm going to give you some examples from my own world and how I was able to go back, look at it, make more sense of it, and ultimately just heal it over. I can't go back and change things, but when you understand it more, when you see it from a wiser, older eye, a lot of times you can put that stuff to rest. I want to tell a story real quick of something that happened to me the other day that will segue into the rest of this episode, just to show you how profound and impactful exploring the events of your life can be for you. Sometimes it's easy to think of a memory, but sometimes those memories come find you. And one came through to me the other day that I hadn't thought of probably in decades. And at first I was like, oh yeah, I remember that. But then as I started digging deeper around it, I actually saw the traumatic consequences that this event had on me and what the implications were after. I was 10 years old. It was late summer of 1991, and I was sitting on the front porch with one of my best friends from my childhood. He lived right across the street from me. We practically grew up together. I had known him for the last 6 years, and his parents had divorced a few years prior, so I started seeing a little less of him, but that night in particular was his last night before his mom, and his sister moved down to Florida, and I never saw him again. So this was us saying goodbye to each other. This was someone who I experienced so many of my firsts with. I learned how to swing on his swing set. And so we're sitting there, we're looking at baseball cards, and all of a sudden I started getting emotional because I started feeling the emotions of what was going on in my head at that time. I was just trying to buy time so he wouldn't leave. And I remember trying to fight back tears. I didn't want him to see me crying. I didn't want my family to see me crying. And so the other day, as I was thinking about this, I started getting emotional. I felt bad for my younger self because I realized something. This was actually the first time in my life that I felt abandoned by somebody. And keep in mind, my parents divorced a year prior, and I never saw my dad after that, but I didn't feel abandonment issues. There's a whole lot of stuff I'll get into that stemmed from that, but I had never been what you would call abandoned before. When we said our goodbyes, I remember going into my room and crying into my pillow and just being wrecked by it. And so this memory that came through that had been long forgotten forced me to revisit and analyze a traumatic, energetic schism that needed my attention. Because it's what happened after, too, that started making more sense of my years after that. I got a little lonelier. I got a little more hardened. My anger kept growing, which was due to numerous things, but that one really, he was a stabilizer in my life. You know, you don't even know that as a kid, but when he's gone, he's gone. And then you could see it in hindsight. But I also got less trusting. I didn't, if anyone can move and uproot, why would I want to be vulnerable around people? And about 9 months later, it happened again. And so I'm able to look at these instances and be like, okay, that is explaining why my behavior became a certain way. That is contributing to why I might have done this or done that. So yeah, there's a lot that you can discover by looking back at your life. So 2 things. First off, if any of you have had any kind of breakup where someone leaves you, it could be a death, it could be boyfriend, girlfriend, it could be a divorce, it could be whatever. Those need revisiting because the event itself is the schism. What needs to be explored is what led to it and then what was the aftermath. How did things change after somebody in your life was gone? What caused a breakup? You have to look at before and after to really make sense of why it happened. And that is where the healing lies. Maybe you became a certain way when someone was out of your life that it wouldn't have happened had they either stayed in your life or if you had the tools to recognize, hey, this is life. Like, people move around. So if any of you have those breakups with any kind, revisit them. The second thing that came out of this memory coming through was something just as profound, maybe even more so, and that was the true power of divorce. I come from a divorced family, so I'm fully aware of what happens when people separate. There is a dynamic power shift all over the place. But when I was looking back at this the other day, I thought, wait, another family's divorce is affecting me negatively. I thought that was so profound because we tend to just focus on what it does within the family unit. But here I am being traumatized over another family's divorce. I thought that was so profound. And so I want to use the topic of divorce in this episode while applying the places I'm telling you to look at, because divorces to me are one of the most traumatizing things that happen to children in this country. But I'm also an adult, and I know breakups and relationships and romances die off. But there's a gazillion things in between all that we should be looking at. And so I'll jump in and show you what my perspective was like going through my own family's divorce. So that of the child, because the parents have a side too. And that's the whole key here, is that as you go back through your life and you heal stuff, if you really want to heal, you're going to have to go through other people's lives, especially your parents, and understand where they were coming from too. Obviously, every divorce is different. The reasons leading to them, the aftermath from them, the sibling situation. With me, I never saw my dad again. But for some, they get to see their mom and dad and they have good relationships with them. But now it's divided up. Sometimes you only get to see your dad or your mom twice a month. And from a child's perspective, objectively speaking, that's not healthy for them. But like I said, relationships end. So you have to understand the parent situation just as much. But from my perspective, the day I found out my parents were divorcing was the day right before 3rd grade started. And it was the happiest day of my life up until that point. I hated my dad. He was an alcoholic, he was abusive, and I mentioned in a previous video, he sexually molested my sister. That was the catalyst for the divorce. Had that not happened, I'm very curious as to what my life would have been as I entered preteen and teenager, because I was getting sick of him. I'll go into a lot more about what my time was like with him, but for this video, it's after he was gone, because I didn't have a father in my life anymore. And as I look back, I can see immediately the new era that came in and how it affected everything from my behavior, from my patience levels, from my thought processes. I was paranoid. I was embarrassed when your dad does something like that. Kids in the neighborhood knew. People knew. People at school might not have. So I was like, who knows who doesn't? It was something like when you have to actually accept the fact that your dad is a child molester and everyone else's dads seem kind of normal and their families are together. It was a hit on my self-confidence. It was something that just got compounded year after year until a certain point where I then started to right that ship. But immediately after, as a third grader, a fourth grader, I mentioned my friend that moved away. There was a time when he had a tent set up in his front yard and a few of us were in it. And we had the conversation of if my dad, my own father, like drove down the street or came anywhere near us, we were going to run inside and get his dad's gun and take care of business. That's a 9-year-old talking like that, not just in general, but about their own dad. And it's like the stress we put on our children. It's only gotten worse nowadays, but I look back and I'm like, well, no wonder I was labeled a problem child. No wonder I was labeled a bad kid. I did act out. I'm responsible for my actions, but as I look back on it and I can make sense of everything, now I understand why I was the way that I was. Now I know why I acted the way that I did. And when you fully understand those circumstances around the way that you were, that's when you can allow forgiveness to come in for yourself. Too many of us live with guilt from things that we did all the way back to our childhood. But when you actually look at the circumstances around you, especially the younger and younger you go, the more you realize you're like, I was a kid. What else was I supposed to do? Well, of course that happened. I was a child. When you're going through life with blinders on, facing one direction, you don't really, especially as a kid, you don't understand most of it. And so what I needed in my life was not just attention, but attention from a strong fatherly masculine presence. I didn't have that. I didn't have that before the divorce either. But it was something that was lacking in my life. I still don't know what it's like to have a fatherly figure say, come here, son. Let me put my arm around you. Let me teach you some things. Let me take those loads off your shoulders. I don't know what that's like. And so I had to teach myself how to be fatherly, how to be strong and masculine in my own right. And boy, oh boy, did I bump my head, fall down, scrape my knees over and over and over again, trying to figure out what is it like to be a man? What is it like to be a man that's not like my dad? I hope I'm not like him. Anytime I got angry, I was like, oh my God, I'm like my dad. Until I realized years and years later that we're each our own sovereign beings. Just because your parent is one way does not mean you have to be like them. But yeah, it was tough. It was a long journey out of hell of trying to become my own strong self. But then I go back, right, and you look at other areas. With my dad gone, who was the breadwinner, my mom was his secretary and a stay-at-home mom up until that point. But with him gone, we started struggling financially. That's something that I had never experienced up until that point. Up until then, I had every toy. I had a Nintendo. I had a pool. We had a car phone before they were even really popular. We didn't struggle financially. It wasn't a thing for me. But then third grade, that hit me like a brick wall. You know, when you're used to having everything you could want and then you don't have, all you crave, or at least all I craved, was to have that again and then some. You know, I had an epiphany just now about my relationship with finances and how up until that point it was non-existent, but at such a young age, there was a schism that was created there where I did not want to be without money, and I thought money was what impressed people. I associated money and material things with a sense of security where people would look at a starter jacket symbol or a logo and just be like, oh, he's cool, he's legit or whatever. And that's not a healthy way to go. So without a dad in my life, not only did I lose the fatherly lessons that a dad should be teaching, I suffered with my insecurity for financial reasons. But now as I also look back, I keep having epiphanies. That should be a father or one of the parents' roles to instill that confidence in the child and be like, material things don't mean anything. It's what's inside that counts. Not to sound corny, but it's true though. I didn't have somebody to instill strength in me. And that's not to knock my mom or anything, but all the strength she had was used up every day working a low-paying job, trying to keep a roof over our heads, raising 2 kids. So I didn't have that full family strength. And with a mom at work, no dad in my life, the behavior started getting worse, getting into more trouble. I started getting into things like pop culture-wise, music, movies that were way beyond my age. Summer of 91, which I've already brought up, was still one of my favorite summers. It was the first summer without my dad, but it was also the summer I discovered MTV. It was the summer I discovered new genres of music, like rap and house music, with videos that were just as heavily sexually gratuitous or even violent to match the lyrics in the songs. I had never seen music videos really before. So that was my MTV summer. And I mean, it rotted my brain. You know, I don't regret it. I love it. I've been able to go back and heal. And like I said, I appreciate everything that I've gone through. But divorces have consequences. It doesn't mean that the parents are wrong for divorcing. It just has consequences, just like any cause and effect. And so what do we do about divorces? Because that's not fair to the kids. But it's also not fair for kids to have parents who are unhappy and miserable and a lot of times can't stand one another. These past few years have really accelerated that in and of itself. And so, in my own humble opinion, the best way to prevent divorces is we all heal ourselves. So we're our best vibrating frequencies to attract in, via the law of attraction, people who are on their same wavelengths. How many of you have said that your parents should never have been together in the first place? You know, as part of my healing process has had to go back and not just forgive myself and understand my own circumstances, but I have had to forgive my parents. I've had to forgive my dad. I don't have hate towards my dad. And this is that second step of the healing process where you go and forgive anyone who has wronged you, anyone who you've had friction with. And that a lot of times starts with the parental units. I see way too often people in their 40s and 50s blaming their parents from their childhood for how their life turned out. You've got to get over that at some point. And the key to it all is forgiving them, to understand that they were who they were before you. They were who they were because of all these other circumstances going back to their childhood. A lot of times they are also victims to certain degrees as well, and they never got to heal. With my own dad, I learned throughout the years things about him, things in his childhood that completely make sense of who he became and why he was the way he was. I also didn't take it personal that he used to beat the crap out of me or what he did to my sister, because he would have done that to any child that he had. My uncle on my mom's side told me that back when they were kids, he knew my dad. They lived in the neighborhood outside Chicago. He even said that he had a weird, perverted sense of sexual humor. My uncle detected something in my dad. I found out years later from my mom that there's a good chance that he was sexually molested when he was a kid too. So here's my dad, you know, his mom died in his teen years, which I heard wrecked him. So here's my dad, this broken piece of trauma coming into the orbit of my mom. And if you fully understand the law of attraction, you are going to bring in exactly what your frequency is vibrating at. So that means my mom had to have been on some kind of similar level, not just to marry him, but to stay with him. And I know things about my mom's past that it's like, well, yeah, I can see why. I can see why you jumped to the first guy that showed you some kind of attention. That doesn't mean she's a bad person. I'm stating the facts of how things work. And so let's analyze this. Two broken people who needed healing of varying degrees coming together to form a family of four. Where is that family now? Well, the patriarch, after the divorce, about 4 years later, drank himself into his own grave. The daughter, my sister, took her own life in November, stemming from unhealed childhood traumas that were caused by this family getting together. So now you have two surviving members. The mother, who I don't even have a relationship with anymore for a multitude of reasons, is suffering in her own misery, has a bunch of health problems herself, just lost her own daughter. That leaves me, the son who was labeled the black sheep, who was labeled the problem child, who had to dig himself out of his own hell for the first few decades of his life and is now healing himself. That leaves me by myself. But that's not good. It shouldn't have been that way in the first place. I should have phenomenal relationships with a father and a mother. My sister should be alive. It's not how it happens. This is what happens not just with divorce, but when broken people come together to create families. The divorce is just the effect. The cause are the people involved. The cause are the people who have their own healing and should maybe be taking care of that first. But how do you know that you're broken? How do you know that you need healing? Everyone's got their own stories. But if you go back to your childhood, you will see where all your habits, your patience, your attitude, your thoughts on life. Look at the parental relationships. Look at the mother and father relationships with your own self. Maybe you come from a divorced family too. Everything needs looking at. It is astounding what you will find by just going back and looking at things with a new perspective, digging under things, overturning them inside and out, analyzing every aspect. My generation as children really saw that uptick of divorces start going up higher and higher. And it's only gotten more and more commonplace. We have way too many broken people running around creating families that we need to take care of our own stuff first, because if we look around, and I'm seeing that anxiety rates in middle school kids are at all-time highs. I'm seeing that Adderall prescriptions are at all-time highs. I'm seeing how unhappy younger generations are. It's because we keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. That's called insanity. We need to fix ourselves, not just to enjoy life and actually be happy and fulfilled in our own right, but if we're going to save this place, we need to create future generations that are happy and loved and fulfilled in ways that we haven't been yet. So that's the moral of my story. It's one person's perspective, a child's perspective on divorce and consequences that come from it. It's just one tale of a divorce. Obviously, my sister, same parents, much different outcome. We all have stories to tell. We all have vantage points. We all have perspectives. We should be talking to each other, checking our emotions, checking our pride, checking our egos at the door, and being like, what did you go through? We should be bonding over all of this stuff. Instead, it's just driving us crazy and dividing us and really putting us into our own isolated miseries. And so I'll just leave it at that. I hope you were able to learn something. I hope you were able to think in a different way just from this episode alone. Last thing I want to do is waste your time, but I feel that is the key. We need to start having conversations with one another and helping each other heal. But first, the conversation with yourself. You got to look in the mirror. You got to accept the fact that you're not perfect. I'm not perfect. No one is. And that you need some healing and some reflection to do as well. Self-actualization is one of the hardest things that one can do, but when you get there, you'll see exactly what I mean. Till next time, friends.
I miss those days, and so I pout like a grown jerk, wishing all I had to do now was finish homework. It's true, you don't realize really what you got till it's gone. And I'm not gonna sing another sad song, but sometimes I do sit and reminisce, then think about the years I was raised back in the day.
Back in the days when I was young, I'm not a kid anymore. But some days I sit and wish I was a kid again. Back in the days when I was young, I'm not a kid anymore.